I don't know how to put it, possess them permanently.
And that's why you killed them.
Right, right. Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me. And
Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His father was a research chemist, while his mother struggled with mental health issues, often experiencing bouts of depression and anxiety. This set the stage for a troubled home environment. From an early age, Dahmer exhibited signs of emotional detachment, isolation, and a preoccupation with death, though these early signs were largely overlooked. As a child, Dahmer showed an unusual fascination with animals, specifically the bones of dead animals. His father recalls an incident when Jeffrey eagerly collected roadkill, claiming to be intrigued by their anatomy. This fascination with dead bodies, often referred to as his bone fetish, would later escalate to terrifying extremes. Dahmer's parents divorced when he was 18, a pivotal moment that coincided with his first murder. The unstable home environment, coupled with his mother's mental health struggles and father's emotional unavailability, likely contributed to his psychological decline. He grew increasingly introverted, and while Dahmer showed some social engagement during his early school years, by high school he became more withdrawn, isolated, and began drinking heavily. While there is debate over whether Dahmer's criminal actions stemmed from childhood trauma or innate psychological predispositions, there is no denying the profound impact his formative years had on his development. Psychiatrists later speculated that Dahmer may have suffered from a range of undiagnosed disorders, including borderline personality disorder and schizotypal personality disorder. His emotional detachment and inability to form meaningful relationships contributed to a growing sense of alienation, which fueled his destructive fantasies. Dahmer himself later admitted that he began experiencing violent fantasies about dominating and controlling men in his early teens. These fantasies included thoughts of rendering his victims unconscious, which later evolved into necrophilia and cannibalism. His reliance on alcohol during this period suggests an attempt to numb these dark desires, but it was only a temporary respite. The divorce of his parents deepened his emotional turmoil. Dahmer was left largely unsupervised, as his mother moved out with his younger brother, leaving Jeffrey alone in the family home. This lack of structure and guidance further enabled his descent into depravity.
Jeffrey Dahmer is recalling his monstrous past. Almost 2 years ago, in this little apartment in Milwaukee, police discovered the grisly remnants of one of the most horrible crime sprees in American history. Jeffrey Dahmer, an unassuming chocolate factory worker, would eventually confess that he had seduced, murdered, and dismembered 17 young men. He even ate some of his victims' body parts.
Jeffrey Dahmer's killing spree began in 1978 when he was just 18 years old. Over the next 13 years, he would claim the lives of 17 young men, predominantly from marginalized communities, such as African Americans and Asian Americans. His victims were often lured back to his apartment under the pretext of friendship, alcohol, or sex before being drugged, murdered, and subjected to gruesome post-mortem activities. Dahmer's first victim was 18-year-old Stephen Hicks. Dahmer picked up Hicks, who was hitchhiking, and offered him alcohol at his family home. After spending time together, Dahmer bludgeoned Hicks with a dumbbell before strangling him. In a chilling foreshadowing of future acts, Dahmer dismembered the body and disposed of the remains. This first murder seemed to ignite a compulsion within him, although he managed to suppress his urges for almost a decade afterward.
One time I brought this young man back to the hotel room, the Ambassador Hotel. Was just planning on drugging him and spending the night with him. I had no intention of hurting him. When I woke up in the morning, he had a broken rib here. I was heavily bruised. Apparently I had beaten him to death with my fists.
Dahmer's second victim, Stephen Tuomi, was killed in a hotel room in 1987 after a night of heavy drinking. Unlike his first murder, Dahmer later claimed to have no memory of killing Tuomi, but he dismembered the body in a fashion similar to his previous victim. The 1987 murder of Tuomi marked the beginning of a gruesome period in which Dahmer killed at least 15 more men. His victims, usually young men, were drugged with sleeping pills and strangled. Dahmer would then engage in necrophilia and dismemberment. The remains of his victims were often kept as trophies: bones, skulls, and even organs, which Dahmer preserved and stored in his apartment. In one particularly macabre act, Dahmer attempted to create human zombies by drilling holes into his victims' skulls and injecting acid or boiling water into their brains. These experiments were an effort to create compliant, unconscious partners whom he could control indefinitely. A series of near arrests and missed opportunities by law enforcement highlight the systematic failures that allowed Dahmer to continue his crimes for so long. One of the most glaring examples occurred in May 1991, when police encountered one of Dahmer's victims, 14-year-old Konorak Synthasamphone, wandering naked and drugged outside Dahmer's apartment. Despite pleas from neighbors and clear signs of distress, police returned the boy to Dahmer, who convinced them that they were involved in a consensual relationship. After the police left, Dahmer killed Synthasamphone.
He was on the couch, lying down with the drilling technique had already been applied, and I thought he was asleep.
In retrospect, this incident stands as a chilling example of police negligence, which enabled Dahmer to continue his killing spree. It wasn't until later in 1991, when one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape and flag down police, that Dahmer's reign of terror was finally brought to an end.
I always knew that it was wrong, but after the first killing was not planned.
After his arrest, Jeffrey Dahmer was remarkably cooperative with law enforcement, confessing to all 17 murders. In detailed interviews with the police and later media, Dahmer explained his twisted motivations. He claimed that his actions were driven by an overwhelming desire to keep his victims close, stating that he didn't want them to leave him. This desire for control manifested in both the necrophiliac acts and his cannibalism, as Dahmer admitted to consuming parts of his victims in an attempt to possess them forever. In interviews, Dahmer expressed regret for his actions, though some questioned the sincerity of these claims. He spoke at length about his feelings of guilt and how he had become a monster who couldn't control his urges. Yet many psychologists argue that while Dahmer's confessions provide insight into his state of mind, they do little to fully explain the sheer brutality of his crimes. Jeffrey Dahmer was finally apprehended on July 22, 1991, when Tracy Edwards, his intended victim, managed to escape and flag down 2 Milwaukee police officers. When officers entered Dahmer's apartment, they found a nightmarish scene: photographs of dismembered bodies, skulls, and preserved organs. The discovery led to Dahmer's immediate arrest, and the public quickly learned of the horrors that had unfolded in his apartment for years. In 1992, Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms for the murders of 17 men. His trial was one of the most sensational in American history, as the sheer horror of his crimes captivated the public. Dahmer's relatively calm demeanor during the trial and the detailed confessions he provided only added to the fascination surrounding him. Jeffrey Dahmer's life came to a violent end on November 28, 1994, in Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. He was beaten to death by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver while performing a work detail in the prison. Scarver later claimed that he had killed Dahmer because of the nature of his crimes, stating that Dahmer would fashion his food into body parts and use ketchup to mimic blood, a claim that added to Dahmer's disturbing persona, even in incarceration. Dahmer's death brought a sense of closure to some of the families of his victims, though it also sparked debates about justice. Was Dahmer's death a deserved fate for someone who committed such horrific acts, or should he have been allowed to live out the rest of his life in prison? The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer is one of horror and psychological intrigue. His crimes raised serious questions about law enforcement's handling of marginalized communities, particularly the LGBTQ+ community and people of color, many of whom were his victims. The police's mishandling of the Cynthia Somphone case is a stark reminder of the racial and social biases that existed at the time. Psychologically, Dahmer remains a fascinating case study. His combination of cannibalism, necrophilia, and attempted zombification of victims defies easy categorization. He wasn't motivated by traditional urges for power or financial gain, but by a dark, twisted need for control and possession.